It was a Ukrainian against two Russians. He knew his chances were very slim, but he kept fighting. This kind of ratio was common in the battles for Vuledar and the surrounding cities, when columns of Russians advanced against the forces of Kiev defending the area. The fighting in the trenches was violent and loud, with prisoners being dragged in the middle of the gunfire and bodies being trampled. Russians placed anti-tank mines inside a building, ready to detonate them and bring down the entire structure. It was the end of the battles for Vuledar, where blood froze in the winter and violence boiled in the summer. Putin smiled nervously in the Kremlin, looking at the map of the conflict in Ukraine, with his mind wandering through the nightmares of war in the rest of the world. His army was advancing through the Donbass, finally making progress after so long with minimal gains, following a conflict marked by his general's hesitation to talk about Kharkiv. Now he knew that the amount of territory gained in July, August, and September was the greatest. The news was so good that Kursk didn't even seem like such a big problem. The war had to continue. Russia was in fact a very fortunate nation in its war against the Ukrainian Nazis and against NATO. It ended up, luckily, controlling the areas with the largest deposits of metal and coal. It also happened that they controlled the country from the areas with the fertile lands in the south and east. If they hadn't lost Kharkiv and the surrounding areas in 2022, they would also have the main reserves of natural gas and oil. But it didn't matter by coincidence. One of the main advances in the battles against Nazism was almost reaching Shevchenko in Donetsk, one of Ukraine's main lithium deposits, a material so important for battery production. The campaign was going well. Luck seemed to be on the side of the great nations, as in the case of the United States, which saved Iraq and the Kurds after Saddam Hussein and by chance found so much oil. Putin smiled when he saw the maps, grateful for Russia's luck and the West's weakness, with its fear of nuclear war and threats of escalating a conflict. One of the current targets was Vuledar, the strategy being to encircle and suffocate the Ukrainian forces. There it seemed to be going well. The Russian forces seemed close to victory there, increasing Kiev's desperation and its pleas for help from the West. While NATO hesitated with its best weaponry and sent leftovers from more than 2 decades ago to the fighting, the Russians advanced against an increasingly weakened Ukraine. But the Ukrainians still had hope. Soldiers like Valor and Schmiegel had lost a lot and weren't there in the middle of that hell for nothing. The Battle of Vuledar was definitely important. The Ukrainians desperately tried to defend the place. Meanwhile, Kiev worked in other ways to try to strike the Russians. In mid-September 2024, Ukrainian drones were once again flying over Russian territory. They headed towards Toropets, where the 107th Ammunition Arsenal of the Main Directorate of Missiles and Craft was located. The site an ambitious target after it was built in 2018. A former Russian Deputy Minister of Defense stated that the site met the highest international standards, and it could defend itself against weapons like missiles and even a small nuclear attack. But it seemed that wasn't quite the case. When the drones arrived, they were shot down repeatedly, but some of them reached the intended depot. Maybe the nuclear bombs and missiles at the time were a bit different from the drones because the explosions that followed were terrifying. It wasn't an exaggeration. It truly felt like the apocalypse was starting. The ground shook and the air vibrated, scaring away courage and hope. After the first wave of destruction, new explosions started appearing. The fires were so intense that data was captured by National Aeronautics and Space Administration satellites. Meanwhile, the explosion was recorded as a magnitude 3.2 earthquake by a Norwegian monitoring agency. The secondary explosions lasted for hours, wiping hundreds of tons of explosives off the face of the earth, such as S-300 air defense missiles, Skander ballistic missiles, and KN-23. Considering that a Skander cost about $3 million, the loss was immense for the Russians. Satellite images showed a destroyed base with the arsenal swept away by fire. The day dawned with smoke rising to meet the clouds and a shy sun in the midst of the explosions. Strangely, the governor gave an interview stating that everything was going well and according to plan, even with curious sounds in the background.
The UAVs were taken down, and upon hitting the ground, a fire started that we're now dealing with.
The satellite images showing before and after couldn't see anything at first except for the cloud of smoke. Later, clearer photos started to appear. Regarding the absurd destruction that happened to the Russian munitions, some external analyses suggested that Kyiv destroyed 2 to 3 months' worth of Russia's ammunition supply. Another Ukrainian attack happened in Feodosia, in Crimea. Ukrainian drones fell on one of the oil storage terminals. The fire spread quickly, tanks exploded with fuel, feeding the flames more and more throughout the night. Day came and once again the sun illuminated the territory occupied by Russia through thick clouds of smoke. These lasted for days. The soldiers tried to help put everything out, but as time went by, the flames spread. Other tanks started to explode, increasing the torment of the Russians even more. Only after 4 days did the fire calm down. The result was 8 tanks completely destroyed. Back in October, it was said that a Su-57 flew over Ukrainian airspace in Donetsk. The plane flew over the combat area, preparing its weapons for a strike. That was one of the most famous Russian fighter jets, which was said to be one of the great instruments of war of the modern era. He was on a vital mission for Russian intelligence. The pilot found his target in the sky, and down on the ground people filmed the white trails in the sky. The chase lasted for a few seconds until a new pale trail appeared. The Su-57 fired the missile, watching as the projectile flew until it hit the aircraft ahead. The fireball lasted for a fraction of a second and the aircraft began to spin toward the ground. It crashed into the ground, violently releasing smoke as a demonstration of its defeat. There was speculation about friendly fire or that the Ukrainians had shot down an enemy Su-25. In fact, the Su-57 destroyed an S-71 of the newest Russian drones. It had gone out of control. That technology couldn't fall into enemy hands. Its remains were filmed on the ground. Later, the full story was reported from the Aktubinsk Air Base, located about 587 kilometers from the front line. The Su-57 fighter jet and the S-70 drone took to the sky for an operational test. During the flight, the drone lost communication with ground control and began to dangerously approach Ukrainian territory. After several unsuccessful attempts to regain control, Russian authorities decided to abort the flight. The S-70 crossed the front line, and with no other option, the Su-57 was ordered to shoot it down, ensuring that the equipment would not fall into enemy hands. Among the identifiable wreckage were a large, relatively intact part of the wing, as well as burned fragments of a glide bomb, the MPB-D30SN, and engine components. These remains offered clear clues about the type of weaponry and technology present in the downed aircraft. The S-70 was developed by Sukhoi to fly at up to 1,000 kilometers per hour, with a range of up to 6,000 kilometers. It could carry up to 2 tons of guided or unguided munitions. Was there a lot going on in the conflict besides the frontline areas? In those months, from July to October 2024, Ukraine sent its drones for these long-range attacks, while its soldiers suffered on the battlefield with the Russian advance. Valery Shchimgol suffered in his trench as the chief sergeant of the 79th. He had the duty to keep his men defending that region, preventing the Russians from advancing beyond the parts they had already taken in Konstantinivka. Earlier, he saw a multi-purpose tracked light armored vehicle and a T-72 drop off more than a dozen soldiers in front of them. The drone saved him. Then another armored vehicle arrived with more men. They managed to take out those three, but Russia didn't stop. The kamikazes tried everything to weaken them. What kind of hell were those pests? Coming down one after another, they kept harassing the trench with explosions, blowing up so many times that Valery tried to keep his mind from thinking about the lists of the dead he would have to make. The feeling was that they were always being watched. The drones flew over the trenches at an altitude where they often couldn't be heard, and sometimes they weren't even looking for victims. But targets with both infantry and artillery munitions destroyed everything. At those times, the trench would get battered. One of the bombardments hit one of Valery's men directly. Far from the others, he tried to apply the tourniquet to his amputated leg. By the time help arrived, he had already bled to death. One of the soldiers rolled across the grass as one of the explosives fell from the Russian drone. The explosion wasn't enough to kill him. He managed to crawl under the trees to get some cover. Another evil gift came from the sky, fell among the trunks, and exploded. Even without seeing him clearly, the Russians still tried to kill the Ukrainian. Valery had to defend his position because Konstantinivka was crucial, especially to stop the Russians from further surrounding Vuhledar. It was complicated because Moscow's forces kept preparing their drones, attaching explosives to the machines and then sending them to the trenches. The explosives kept falling among the trees once again, wearing out the soldiers. The improvised defenses started to fall apart, leaving the men exposed to the violence of the war. The Russians recorded the clear terror in their movements as they waited for the next explosion. Those who survived the precise artillery fire supported by the drone, they were grateful for their lives, but some grew desperate, searching for other places where death was not certain. With the next shot, there were still waves of soldiers approaching. After so many explosions, soldiers arrived on their damned motorcycles so quickly that they weren't seen or caught by the kamikaze drones. Sometimes they surprised the soldiers, capturing those who were alone, accompanied only by the corpses of their comrades. The Ukrainian position suffered from the speed of these attacks. They arrived too quickly, going behind the trenches, and the explosions spread over the Ukrainians. Cornered, the smoke suffocated him. He felt it hot on his face, passing over his dark skin like a billowing shroud of death. The enemy prevented any reaction until the Russian approached with his rifle to execute the man hiding. They continued on their way, finding the next one, who hid in a house. They fired from the entrance, forcing the soldiers to defend themselves in the rooms. The explosions delivered by the drones broke the resistance of these men. Valery received the news of so many deaths with sorrow. His sister had already said that their mother passed away a few months ago, maybe because of so much worry, because she had a son. During the war, he still had to support his daughter, his sister, and his nieces. Born in Vinicius in 1978, he hoped to grow a little older and see this war end so he could return to his city. What gave him hope was watching the Russian columns being blown up in the fields, often before they reached his trench. They had taken control of Novy-Mikhailivka a few months ago, and from there they set out to continue the siege of Vuhledar. The fire spread several times among the Russian metal, taking the lives of the men along with the vehicle. The Russian columns kept trying. It was more common for them to arrive in small waves with one vehicle and fewer than a dozen men. But the Russians always kept those armored vehicles moving, going through minefields and artillery rain. They were aware that the Ukrainian arsenal was limited. At some point they would get through, and that happened several times. The transports came to drop off their men. Some of them found mines after doing their training. Russian soldiers were cornered in buildings where the kamikazes visited them. The survivor was lost in pain, trying to put out the fire on his leg. The grenade that fell should have killed him, but it only devoured part of his body. His mind got stuck trying to fight the fire while his body slowly died. Unable to finish the task of stopping the heat from licking his skin, the waves kept coming one after another and Valery had to deal with them. One of the soldiers from Moscow was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade right after landing. The other saw a swarm of lead trying to sting their bodies. One of those soldiers fired back while the other tried to protect himself. More men landed, seeking positions. The crouched Russians kept up the suppressive fire while their comrades began to flank. That gave them the opportunity to break into Valery's defenses. The Master Sergeant of the 79th greeted them with everything he had. The shots took down some of them, but the ammunition was limited, just like the defenders' lives. At some point, the wave engulfed and drowned them. In the sea of violence, Valery fell. In combat, the Russians advanced far enough in Konstantinivka to keep the flanks of the soldiers advancing further south well protected. The noose was tightening. The Russian Mikhail Evgeny was 24 years old when he left the village of Andreevsk in the Chelyabinsk region for the war. He contacted his relatives saying he would leave after the attacks in Novomikhailivka. Then he grabbed his rifle and went to get on the BMP. In June 2024, the Russians attempted one of their traditional columns heading toward Vuhledar. Mikhail went along, still without telling his family that he was going to The attack was accompanied by motorcycle squads and met with drones flying low to strike the dozens of armored vehicles. Same attempt, same results, explosions all over the field, destroying millions of dollars in equipment as well as the lives of dozens of soldiers. Advances inside the city hardly happened in July, even though the motorcycle battalions were efficient in taking them. In this case, the noise and slowness of the armored vehicles drew attention to the motorcycles, which left dozens of them scattered around. It was a new kind of metal sculpture. Adding to the destroyed tanks, many of the targeted soldiers survived without their motorcycles or tanks and were pursued. One of them ran alone among the short trees that were trying to grow. In the midst of the destruction, the drone waited until it got a shot, devouring the man's back and neck with jaws of fire. Mikhail Evgeny was in the middle of this chaos. He saw the men lost in the field. They tried everything to escape from the drones. One of them threw a stone at the flying demon, but then disappeared into the smoke. The survivors who managed to reach the positions despite the destroyed column tried to dig defenses, surprised by the drones flying overhead. One of the men ducked at the right moment, but the fragments tore through part of his torso. Mikhail Evgeny disappeared. In these attacks, relatives recorded videos in support groups asking for information about him to learn more about his fate. This stage of the battles for Vuledar included talking about other cities. One of them was Vodiane to the east. There, the Russians blew up some enemy armored vehicles, but they also saw their own burning near the tree lines. The Russian bombardments became increasingly intense starting in August. A carpet of fire and smoke formed over Vodiane. The booms of the explosions merged to the point of becoming a cacophony of destruction. It was the poetry of war, raging and killing Ukrainians in the small town. Aviation from the Vostok group hit the territory of one of the coal mines with half-ton bombs. The planes flew from Donbass, dropping dozens of glide bombs. Tons of explosives rained down on the mines used as Ukrainian bases. Just like the Battle of Vuhledar marked by the salt mines, Vuledar is now marked by the explosions over its main source. What happened? 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 What? Sending the message back against the Ukrainians, the Russians sent men like Kuzlan Kozlov. Look, it was no surprise that they decided to send another column of armored vehicles. Those were blown up in the middle of the field. Again, they had to go through a minefield that had been prepared over the last 2 years. Some soldiers managed to escape the explosions, ran through the trees until rescue picked them up in the middle of the river, but the attacks persisted. Kozlov was among the men who entered Vodiane's defenses, going through everything the 72nd threw at them. It was close, but they finally managed to reach a line of trees, forcefully engaged the enemies, and the fire and smoke made the environment inside the armored vehicle unbearable. Some were fatally hit as they disembarked, but others were quick to move forward and attack, allowing the transport to retreat before the artillery struck it. They were still lucky that one of their drones managed to shoot down a Ukrainian quadcopter, which could have helped enemy artillery or dropped grenades on them. Kozlov saw the men ahead. With steady fire against the Ukrainian positions, the AKS brutalized the enemy positions, firing dozens of shots and pushing the Ukrainians further and further back into their defensive positions. Kozlov saw the men ahead. With steady fire against the Ukrainian positions, the AKS brutalized the enemy positions, firing dozens of shots and pushing the Ukrainians further and further back into their defenses. They reloaded quickly for the next wave of violence. Don't lose the momentum. Corners were crucial points. When the drone warned that there was shelter on one side, they threw the grenades. They fired as a group, forcing the surviving opponents to crawl towards surrender. The brutal advance inside the trench resulted in the capture of another position and a wounded prisoner. One of the waves ended up capturing Vodiane. At the beginning of September 2024, the mines were already Russian. It was a big effort, supported by the interruption of supplies and support that came from the Konstantinivka highway. The final celebration was with the total destruction of the tallest building in the region. The soldiers placed the anti-tank mines and then detonated them from a distance, bringing down the building and announcing their victory. In Vodiane, Kozlov knew that the wolf's mouth was closing in on its prey. Vuledar knew it was practically surrounded. The commander of the 72 and Mechanized Brigade complained that his troops had no air defenses and were exhausted because they had no rotations. The bombings were destroying everything in Vuledar, and the 3 tons of a high-explosive aerial bomb, 3,000 glide bomb, were announcing that an even greater disaster was about to happen. The Russians tried to get through in every way, and it seemed with luck, the Russians tried. He tried to cross a minefield without using an armored vehicle. The mine raised a column of fire when it was triggered, but the men still managed to escape. Even though they were a bit shaken, the Russians kept getting closer. Moscow sent not only the 155th Naval Infantry, but also troops like the 14th Separate Special Purpose Brigade and the 36th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade. In addition to the traditional Stormzine, the Ukrainian javelins fired at the enemy tanks, trying to stop so many men invading their territory. The 425th Separate Assault Battalion Skala tried to provide support with artillery. They blew up the Russian enemy, who were approaching with what ammunition they had left. The soldiers inside the armored vehicles were often saved by the protection. Their work didn't end there. They left the transport and ran to attack the Ukrainians. The Russians appeared in front of the trenches in large numbers, and some Ukrainians were left alone. Faced with these assault groups, the defensive position favored the lone soldier. A thrown grenade exploded near the Russian's head, tearing his body apart. Another one rolled to take cover, which ended up putting him in the perfect line of sight for the Ukrainian's Kalashnikov. The Russian soldier was still rolling when the Kiev fighter stood up and aimed his rifle to save Putin from having to pay another salary and bonus. In the Special Operations Zone, a Russian BMP-2 tried to approach with its troops, but it encountered a vehicle of the same model manned by Ukrainians right in front of it. The 2A-4230 MS automatic cannons fired. The Ukrainian projectiles were more effective at tearing through enemy metal, along with the flesh inside it. But it was no use. It was a small victory during the day, which fueled hopes that were consumed by the white phosphorus raining down on the city at night. Soldier Kozlov saw the end of the Battle of Vuhledar approaching. By September 22, the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar had become even more critical. With the risk of encirclement intensifying, Russian forces were advancing from all sides, closing off the last remaining access to the city. Kozlov saw the men at the front throw the grenade at the Ukrainians' shelter. Afterwards, the AKS finished the job, one less trench, one more corpse, and they got out of the hole to continue entering the city. First, the kamikaze drones came after them among the ruins, then the artillery dropped the cluster munitions that took so many members of the squad. The explosions tore apart any cohesion of the attack. The men tried to hide, but the drones found them everywhere. Those who survived kept crawling through the difficult terrain. Even those were hunted down. It was heartbreaking to see those propellers in the sky throwing everything against them. The hope was that there were already so many Russian troops inside the city that the Ukrainians couldn't take out all the drones. They really tried. They were the main weapon in that constant lack of ammunition. Their goals struck against many Russian lives. But behind the corpses, there were more of them coming, advancing in the intervals while more drones were being prepared. At the end of September, there were so many bombs falling on Vuhledar that no one could survive. Smoke and fire took turns, covering the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers or forcing the survivors to escape. Everything was an explosion in Vuhledar. The attacks came from all directions during the day. The 72nd made an effort. Their men attacked the Russian BMP, which showed up to drop off yet another wave. The fire came from the armor of the vehicle, but it didn't stop. The men of the 72nd watched from inside the buildings as the fortress they had fought for 2 years was falling apart before their eyes. It was 2 years on the front line, enduring everything the Russians sent. Unlike what happened in Bakhmut, the order finally came from Kyiv for the 72nd to withdraw from the city. The Russian victory was acknowledged on October 3, 2024. The flags of the Federation and Kremlin troops took over the city. Men like Kozlov disappeared in the midst of the celebrations. Relatives sent desperate videos in the groups asking for support. Any information about so many men missing in the Battle of Vuhledar, so many recent Russian victories made it seem like Ukrainians were dying in the conflict. They also brought the Hollywood delusion that the conquest of cities like Vuhledar happened in just a month or a week. Deaths like Kozlov's, or of so many buried in Russia's cemeteries, were denied or ignored. In the midst of the celebrations, the faces of relatives, most often women asking for information about sons, husbands, brothers, were a cherished reminder. Too much of a mark of the cost of victory to be taken into consideration. It was meaningless for these people to see the piles of armored vehicles scattered around the city, all burned out in the offensive, many with rotting corpses inside. That's why it was more satisfying to see only the Ukrainian cemeteries, with so many flags waving and generating happy comments about the massacre, about so many enemies and an easy victory. The illusion of glory kept the war machine running, ideology corroding the mind. Thus, the toast between death, war, and the ambition of politicians continued.